much for being here. It's a real pleasure to have Professor Grainne De Burca in the Max Weber program. And we would like to start with a question regarding your profile as a legal scholar who has been working both in Europe and in the US, as your profile at NYU Law School, but also the European University Institute before in the UK. So how your profile as a transatlantic legal scholar has shaped also your career, your way of teaching, your way of doing research?
Yes. So first, thanks for having me here, and thanks for inviting me to the interview. So I think that's a very profound question in a way, because I think my career, my research, my agenda, my way of thinking has been profoundly shaped by moving. I mean, I actually moved several times because my legal training was in Ireland. I did an LLM in the US, in Michigan, but then I returned to Ireland for 2 years to train for the bar there. So my first move was already to the UK, where it was quite a change. Even though these are both common law systems so close together, it was a very, very different move for me. And I ended up at Oxford University wanting to be actually a legal theorist. That's how I began. I wanted to be a legal theorist. All the subjects I'd studied and enjoyed were in legal theory, political theory, legal philosophy. But I found myself in a legal system where nobody seemed to teach or study European Union law, and yet there was an increasing sense at that time, this was the late 1980s, that students needed to learn European Union law, and there was a move to make it compulsory. So I found myself under great pressure to teach European Union law, and I thought, you know, that wasn't really what I thought I would be teaching, but I started to teach it and very quickly discovered this very interesting dynamic in the UK, where there's obviously a very strong attachment to parliamentary sovereignty, a notion of parliamentary sovereignty, and there were very different kinds of tensions there with membership of the EU and the significance of EU law. And I found myself getting really fascinated, and all the questions of legal theory that I had been interested in sort of were situated in a new context for me then, thinking about notions like sovereignty and primacy and law and authority and so on, but in the context of the European Union as this novel system, and a state like the UK with its history and tradition, its particular kind of legal system, posed all kinds of interesting challenges. And then my move to Florence to here was again serendipitous. It was, I had been 9 years, I think, in Oxford. I was probably ready for a change, and it was just an irresistible, choice. Somebody sent me the ad, and I thought, well, why not? I thought it was unlikely, but I, applied for it. And then when I came here, of course, it's a completely different, as you both know, a completely different environment, very cosmopolitan, very transnational, very multiple perspective, kind of intellectual environment, and that was fascinating too, multilingual, multicultural, in a way that the UK was not, that, America was not, Ireland was certainly not. And so I think my view on European Union law and scholarship sort of changed here also. I think it was here I began to look more at, I did a few projects together with Joanne Scott, and it was just about the time that the obsession with primacy and constitutionalism and so on was beginning to be tested and challenged a bit, and we had a research project on the move from uniformity to flexibility, and around that same time too we began to work on issues of law and governance, and the very interdisciplinary environment here at the EUI is conducive to that, I think. So the idea of seeing the EU not just from a legal perspective, but the broader perspective of EU studies was very enriching as well. So I think a lot of my work around that time turned to questions of governance and the interaction of law and policy and regulation. And then the move to the US, which is another change again, has been another very interesting phase, I think, of my scholarly thinking, because suddenly I find myself looking at the EU sometimes as an outsider, instead of as an insider, beginning as an Irish person learning this in the context of the Irish legal system, then teaching it in a parliamentary sovereignty system like the UK, and then finding myself in a very interdisciplinary, multicultural, kind of pro-European environment like the EUI, and suddenly to be in the US, where everything changed. You know, I had to teach the subject. It became something like, you know, first I had to teach a subject to students who were not European, whose interest was almost you know, anthropological. You know, in the EU is another system like Asian law, or, you know, the law of South America, but it was Europe, you know, and so to find an angle on Europe that explained why it mattered, what was interesting about it, what was different about it, was quite different from teaching it in the EU, where it's just taken for granted. It's the law, you need to understand it, you're living within this system and so on. But also I began then to see the EU as an actor in the world in a way that I hadn't really spent that much time thinking about before, because I was very conscious of the way the media in the US perceived the EU, and it was from the perspective of a partner, a bloc, whether it was you know, an obstacle to US power in the world or an ally, or whether, you know, trade relations were mutually conducive to you know, economic development, or, you know, whatever else. And so I started to think about how the EU was perceived internationally and how it acted internationally. And so I guess the last few years a lot of my work has been looking at that interface of the EU and the world. So I may have started with issues of constitutional law and primacy and so on, moved then maybe to more interdisciplinary issues of law and governance and so on, and then to issues of the EU and its role in the world. So maybe that sort of partly explains how my personal trajectory and moves are reflected in the scholarship and the different influences that different environments had on my scholarship.
Okay, following on from that, I was wondering whether you, as a scholar of legal scholar of the EU, do you see yourself as a participant in the construction of the European Union, or do you see yourself as an exterior
actor,
someone who's exterior, observing what's going on from a more detached and scientific position?
It's an interesting question. You know, being in the US removes you to some extent from the immediacy of being part of a system, and so one might expect my answer would be, oh, more so now as a detached observer than an internal participant. I think everyone is probably a little bit of both. Everyone who's a scholar of the system that they live in is a little bit of both, even if one doesn't acknowledge one or other of those sides. But I think my detached scholarly observer lens always felt dominant and stronger than the construction, or, you know, participating in the construction of. You know, I think I've always been ambivalent about European integration, in the sense of having a very strong kind of emotional attachment to the idea of any kind of transnational cooperation, and maybe particularly European because I'm European and part of that, but also a lot of ambivalence about its actual manifestations, you know, the emphasis on economic integration and how that has the negative implications that it's had long before the Euro crisis and the huge, you know, growth of Euroscepticism. I think there was always an ambivalence about the project of European integration. Never had the, you know, the soul that Václav Havel spoke of. And so, on the one hand, it's a miracle, you know, European integration. There are, you know, hundreds of years of war, and now we have the one kind of really obvious dividend of the EU is that the countries that are members of the EU are not at war, and it doesn't appear likely that they will be at war again with one another, and that's an enormous achievement in today's world. But then there's also the European marketization of life in some ways, and you know, I think I have always had some ambivalence about that, and so never really saw myself as someone who was there to promote the project of integration. I want to understand it. I want to try, to the extent that I'm a proactive actor within that process, to make it better, steer it in the way it could go. But for example, if someone had asked me, would you work for one of the institutions, I would have said no. I had no interest in working for one of the EU institutions, unless as an external consultant who's got freedom to say what I think and believe rather than being bound to a script. So I don't know whether that answers your question, gives you some feel.
Yes, it does.
And regarding the role of EU scholars in today Europe, and drawing on your article on Europe raison d'être today, So how do you see the role of EU legal scholarship today? Can any input be provided, for example, from the US context? I saw your articles also on the comparison between EU and the US. So what can EU legal scholars learn something from the US? Is there any trend in this?
I mean, I think, to some extent one always learns from the other. There's always learning possible, and looking at another system and how it interacts can tell you something. I think, some of the scholarship I've written, so I wrote a piece on CADI a few years ago, and the piece on comparing the US and the EU court's approaches to international law was in that vein. I think I wanted to say something which has been unpopular and people haven't liked to hear it, but which I see, and if I see it I feel I should say it, which is that the EU does pride itself on being different in some ways, as a multilateral actor, as a constitutional actor, as a normative actor. But I see aspects of the way the EU acts which looks rather similar to me to the ways the US acts, and so I think that it's important to point to those, and I think the European Court has not really participated in the same way as maybe the political rhetoric suggests in being an internationalist, multilateralist court. It's very much a closed institution, not closed, but very much an autonomous institution which prides that above all, the idea that it is its own actor, sets its own norms, that's the constitutional framework, and interaction with other systems, whether the international system, the UN, comparatively, anything else is secondary. And I think that has implications. I'm not saying it's the wrong choice, right? I just think it has implications, and I think it's good to point that out. So I think that's what I was trying to do in that. I think I was interested to look and see, okay, well, the CADI case, people, when I wrote that piece, people said, that's one case, and you pick out a few cases and you say, well, the court is turning against international law, it's not taking international law seriously, or it chooses its own norms rather than trying to articulate its values in terms that are also shared by the international community. That's an aberration. So I thought, well, let me look at, and so I tried to do, I'm not statistically trained, but tried to look at a selection of the case law, as many of the relevant cases as I could over 10 years, and compare them. Now it's a difficult comparison methodologically because the caseload of the Supreme Court is tiny compared to the Court of Justice, and it's selected, so the Court of Justice doesn't select its case law on the whole. And so you could say these are apples and oranges, what can you tell? But I still think there's some interesting things to see both qualitatively and quantitatively in that. As regards the more kind of normative or positive question you asked about, can scholars play a role in, giving advice to the EU and so on? I mean, I think yes, that there are many roles scholars can play. Whether they, scholars can be important or not, it's not up to them. They really, ideas matter, and if your ideas are strong, I think they will have an impact. And to the extent that you promote ideas that are trying to improve things, I think that's a very positive role for an academic. Some people don't choose that, they're more scientific, they want to just analyse what's happening rather than propose something. But I think many scholars also want to have this more normative role. My raison d'etre piece was thinking about, just reflecting on why it is that the EU suffers from this persistent crisis of legitimacy. It's been something constant throughout the history of the EU, but really sharpened since the Maastricht Treaty, and very much on the agenda. And there's an interesting relationship between the gradual politicisation of the EU post-Maastricht and the legitimacy troubles of the EU post-Maastricht. And I'm one of those who believes that more politicisation is a good thing, even though more politicisation has brought divisions and schisms and scepticisms and everything else. But I think ultimately that's the only way for a healthy modern political system to develop. I think if a transnational system remains an elite system, as the EU kind of has, then it will not flourish. And I think that's what we're seeing. So it has to learn to somehow combine the elite vision with some kind of genuine participatory dimension, and not just, however positive an actor the European Parliament is in ways, it's not, it doesn't bring transnational democracy. It brings elements of that, but it doesn't make for a connected citizenry in the way that the EU, I think, seems to need. So I was trying to think about in that piece, well, what what would it be that would bring people to see the EU positively or see it as a positive force, that kind of vaguely romantic idea I spoke to you about at the beginning, which is that I have an attachment to the idea of integration, of transnational integration more generally, but European integration in particular. And why is that? You know, it's something to do with this early idea that Weiler had of civilizing interstate relations, you know, that you know, it is possible to imagine a world where interstate interaction is civilized, and that's something that the EU, for all its quirks and strangeness and bureaucracy and everything else, has done. And so that's a value worth pursuing. And so I was trying to think, well, what is it then? You know, people don't see that in these times of Euro crisis and austerity and bureaucracy and so on. People don't see the value of transnational cooperation particularly. So I was trying to re-articulate that. What is the value of transnational cooperation? What is it that Europe provides today that is positive, rather than just some vague idea of cooperation? And I thought that the way that you know, Giuliano Amato and others had identified it as that the major challenges of today, you know, disease, terrorism, climate change, migration, look what's happening in Europe at the moment, you know, these are all things no state can manage alone, you know, and the EU together, if it were a, you know, an effective actor, could manage these better.
And in relation to these ideas, the issue of human rights, I mean, you've written about that also, and recently we've had the Court of Justice clamping down on the project of accession to the ECHR. How do you read this development, and how do you think that changes your previous ideas on the commitment of the EU to human rights in any way?
It's very tempting, these kind of things, to say, I told you so, but in fact I think I might have been one of the only people who wasn't surprised by the judgment, and I was trying to explain to somebody at the time why I wasn't surprised. I think I've been getting a clear message for years from the reading I've done, from reading extrajudicial writings of judges, from occasionally talking to actors within the court, but also the Council of Europe, judges of the Court of Human Rights. I became aware, in a way that did surprise me initially, that, you know, the court was an actor with serious reservations about accession, in a way that all the other actors' objections had gradually been overcome, you know, during the negotiation process with France, with the UK and so on, times Ireland, but, you know, in the end all the political objections were overcome, a draft agreement, and I think they were so focused on that, and also because the court isn't seen as a political actor, it's not really a political actor, the idea of taking seriously this deep, I don't know how to put it, reservation that the judges had about the idea of this accession and what it would imply for their role and their capacity to be the final arbiter of issues to do with the validity of EU law, its primacy, its relation to human rights in the states, in the member states and so on. I think people underestimated that. I think, you know, in a piece I wrote, which I think we're going to discuss in a seminar tomorrow, The Road Less Travelled, you know, I kind of anticipated this, you know, approaching the court. I noticed that all throughout the negotiations, the court had really serious reservations about how this would affect its autonomy. And, you know, I think maybe had people listened a little more to these extrajudicial, you know, writings, words and so on, listened to what the Strasbourg court was saying, you know, the members of the Strasbourg court mentioned on a number of occasions they felt that the European court wasn't, you know, wasn't willing to, you know, to share as collaboratively with them as it had, that they would have meetings and they didn't feel that the court, they felt that the court was closing itself off a bit. I think it fits very much with this image that I see of the court in cases like Cadi, which is just, it's very conscious of the importance of making the EU a successful entity, and it believes that the way to do that is to be an autonomous constitutional system with its own values, a strong court, a strong legal system. Its dominant interest is collaboration with the member states and member state courts and having EU law accepted, and it sees its role as that to guard that process of making sure EU law is acceptable. So external influences disrupt that, and an external influence, even a human rights court, disturbs that, because this court could come out with some ruling that would undermine a legislative bargain carefully, painfully, negotiated by the EU legislature, and the court trusts itself to decide on those questions of rights, like in the digital rights case or the Khadi case or whatever, and it is very reluctant, I think, to share that jurisdiction with another court. So I think there's a deep obstacle there still to be overcome.
But if I might just follow up on that, when you mention the fact that you feel that a majority of scholars were very surprised by this, I mean, how do you explain that? Do you feel that says something about the way EU law scholarship is?
No, I mean, I think it was natural in a way, because the court isn't, it's a court and their judges are cautious about they don't express political views. I think I just had been very interested in this question for a long time and was listening very closely, and also in fora where maybe not everyone has access to, to speak to judges from the Strasbourg court or from the Luxembourg court. It was simply an impression I was getting, which I added together with extrajudicial writings of some of the judges, and I thought, oh, there are serious concerns here. There are serious concerns, more serious than people realise. I'm not saying I anticipated the judgment, but when it came out, I thought, well, it fits in a way with that. It's striking, I think, and surprising, because, and I think everyone was right to be surprised in one way, because it's an extremely strong position for a court to take. That court is a confident court, given the political consensus. Overwhelmingly, it took, how many years did it take to get Protocol 14 to the Council of Europe Statute ratified? Russia and so on, was it 10 years or something, so eventually to get Protocol 14 ratified, to make accession possible, eventually to get the UK on board, France on board, to get a draft agreement negotiated where everyone was okay, and politically all the final hurdles. This was almost a ticking the box. I don't think, I think they anticipated maybe some rules of procedure would have to be amended first, or some little qualifier, something more like the Advocate General's opinion. But I think the idea of it being a firm no, too many things not to our satisfaction yet. I think that, so I'm not saying people should have realised, I'm just saying that it was something I had been thinking about for a long time, because it was something I was interested in, and I had noticed there was this sort of thread of, not scepticism in any kind of negative, but rather just concern that the court had, and judges in the court had, that this is going to affect the constitutional system of the EU they've been carefully constructing and protecting. And I think maybe not enough attention was paid to that. I think Daniel Halberstam wrote a bit about this recently too, saying, look back at Opinion 294. It was oblique, it was only a passage, and so on, but what do they mean by that? Fundamental institutional implications. The court had these concerns, and these concerns haven't been overcome. So yeah, a lot of people are very disappointed, and a lot of people are shocked and wondering where to go from here. There's so much political momentum behind this, and I think so I think probably the energies are going in now to trying to think about how to overcome it, how to take seriously those qualifications the court has mentioned, and see is there a way in which the circle can be squared.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.